Welcome to RSAC Conference 2025. We're here recording live from the CyberRisk TV studio in Broadcast Alley at Moscone West. I'm your host, Matt Alderman, and joining me for this interview is Dr. Alexander Yampolsky.
Yampolsky.
I want to mix it the other way. I want to go Yampolsky. Anyways, I got it. All right. Co-founder, Chief Executive Officer at SecurityScorecard. Welcome, Alex.
Matt, good to be with you.
So we're going to talk supply chain detection and response. But before we get into the topic, is supply chain a subset of vendor risk management, or do you equate them the same? I have a lot of experience on the third-party risk management side. Do you differentiate the difference between a third party and a supplier? Do you look at them the same? How would you describe that?
Well, a third party could be a different type of,
Right.
there could be different type of relationships. You could be a supplier to a company.
Right.
You could be a subsidiary. You could be an M&A target, an investment. So I think a third party encompasses a whole set of business relationships, and being a supplier is one of them.
Correct. So when we talk about supply chain in the terminology from a security scorecard perspective, are you just looking at the supplier side of this, or are you also looking at the other vendor relationship side?
We're
as
looking
well?
at any
Okay,
relationship.
everything.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So as I said before this, so I used to run third-party vendor risk management program at a bank, large bank, back in 2004, and managed 70,000 vendors. And I remember the process, right? Of you send them a questionnaire, you get the answers back, and it just didn't scale very, very well. What I think you guys have done is very interesting in that you take data from the outside and use that as part of a gauge to assess a vendor. So when you think about that data, what I'm really interested in is how does that then lead to a detection and response capability?
Yeah, so if you think about third-party risk management space, it went through a set of evolutionary changes. If you rewind the clock to 12, 13 years ago, what companies used to do when they deal with third-party relationships is either they do nothing, they pretend the problem doesn't exist,
Right.
or they send they just send a pen and paper questionnaire and ask you, do you have multi-factor authentication like you've done?
Right.
Show me your controls, can you show me your SOC 2 policy? So it was a check-the-box compliance-driven exercise. The next stage of evolution was what we introduced, and some other companies introduced with security ratings,
Right.
where you had objective, trusted KPIs of how you could use to prioritize and stack rank out of 10,000 suppliers you have. What are the 10% that you need to look more closely?
Right.
What are the 10% that you just fast track the process because they have a good security hygiene, and somewhere in the middle you decide what to do. So that was the next evolution because you introduced metric-driven scientific approach.
Right.
What we observed, as the space took shape, is a lot of companies still don't know how to build scalable programs. They do a fairly good job figuring out who their suppliers are. Then, thanks to different type of inventions like security ratings and other techniques, they do a fairly good job stack ranking the vendors and figuring out what the risk is. The country risk, the financial risk, the security risk. The part where everybody falls short is, now that you've done it, so what?
Right.
Like, how do you actually communicate with them? How do you interact with the suppliers?
Or how do you monitor them?
And so that led to the launch of supply chain detection and response. And the basic idea is you have XDR that CrowdStrike pioneered, where you have endpoint detection and information from other devices. You have MDR, which is managed detection response. So with the supply chain detection response, you apply the same principles, but you collaborate with your suppliers. You operate before the boom. If we assume that inevitably one of your third parties is going to get hacked, it's inevitable. How do you stay ahead of it to make sure you inoculate yourself? Like,
Right.
It's inevitable that they're going to get hacked, but you don't need to get hacked as a result of it. So how do we give you those early indications and ability to jointly collaborate and remediate issues ahead of time?
Awesome. What data do you need to do that, right? Because you have a lot of external telemetry, which is very valuable, but you also have to kind of marry that a little bit with the internal control environment, don't you? To understand what that control state looks like, how susceptible they are to that attack. Do you grab both you already have the external, but are you grabbing some of that internal data in this detection and response capability?
Yeah. So the whole point is you can reach out to your suppliers, you ask them to upload evidence,
Okay.
then we use AI to parse and look at the evidence, On top of it, we have a marketplace with over 100 connectors into CrowdStrike, Palo Alto networks, and various other
Okay.
technologies, so you can actually pull telemetry as well. But then you use the 10 years of historical data that we've collected to try to process and see what are the potential discrepancies. Somebody might tell you, you know what, I got a beautifully configured endpoint protection, but you're seeing indications that malware is beaconing outside of the infrastructure, so you could notice discrepancies. So the whole point is, how do you use this 10 years of historical data
Yeah.
and marry it to the answers that you receive?
So you're not only pulling in telemetry sources like CrowdStrike and others, you're also looking at, because not all that data is automatable in some respects, right? There's great data in the telemetry sources to understand, well, what's your endpoint configuration look like, et cetera. But then you need to look at their policies, their procedures, do they have business continuity, disaster recovery? Do you consume that then as actual documents and then try to parse that data to understand the control effectiveness of the supplier?
Exactly. So you have various degrees of confidence that you can attain. For example, if you just look at a outside-in hygiene of a supplier where you use different security signals that we pick up from outside, you can form an opinion about the probability distribution curve. Are they doing a good job? Are they doing a terrible job? Completely from outside, you're not going to get things like compensating controls or
Right.
certain type of things of how they segmented
Right.
the environment on the inside. So you get one degree of confidence. Then if you pull additional telemetry, if you ask additional questions on a questionnaire, you keep increasing the degree of confidence. But you don't want to go do it for every supplier. You want to do it only for your most critical suppliers.
right.
And for everybody else, you need some type of a quick litmus test to just get alerted and have automation. If somebody has a malware or their score drops, then you want to get alerted and have automation telling you those type of things.
So that's where I want to go next from a detection response perspective, because the way the programs used to work, and my guess is most programs still work this way, you go out, you assess your high risk vendors, and then you get the results back. Maybe you put in some remediation projects to track them, and then you don't touch them for another year. There's so much that can change in that span, so I'm assuming that by constantly pulling this data and looking at their external perimeter and the attack surface and the changes in the threat profiles, that you can actually identify potential concerns, and then do you flag those up to the company that's buying the solution? Is that how you're doing it, is monitoring all those
we have
pieces?
we have a robust set of automation that you could configure. Every single day you can detect what assets arrived and departed
Okay.
from the attack surface of the company,
Yeah.
and what signals arrived and departed. And so dynamically you can set up all kinds of workflow automation to make sure that what companies do is they set up policies. They set up kind of a risk tolerance threshold of what they're willing to accept.
Right.
For example, if you're one of my suppliers, I don't want you to ever have ransomware. And if I notice from outside that you have ransomware, I need to have a conversation with you.
Right.
So they might not talk to the suppliers for a year, but then if one of the days you have some type of a concerning event, you definitely want to get ahead of it. And I think
Absolutely.
using AI and automation helps you with being able to do it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, manually would be
It's
too
impossible.
hard to do.
Yeah, I manage 70,000 vendors by hand. There's no way the humans can scale to do this. And I see, I've talked to a lot of clients that, they'll get hundreds of these reviews a quarter. And so to keep up with it manually is going to be extremely difficult. So that's why I was curious about, obviously, as you're monitoring both the internal and external environment, you're just driving that data into them and allowing them to see the alerts, decide whether it's critical, and then decide next steps from a remediation perspective.
The extra benefit of SCDR, supply chain detection response, is that vendors and suppliers are really fatigued from having to answer the same questions over and over again.
I know.
So if you could allow them to answer once and then reuse these answers and to kind of configure almost their trust profile to prove to others that they're doing a good job, then that makes the job much less onerous and makes them more eager to engage.
Yeah.
And so I think that we need to avoid the situation where one bank asks you a set of questions, sends you a security rating
Yeah.
report, another bank sends you another security rating, another
Right.
questionnaire. Now all of a sudden you're just spinning your wheels entire day. You need to be able to answer it once and then reuse your responses effectively in an exchange
Yeah.
to prove that you
So
were
are you
safe.
building the exchange as part of this offering
That's
as
part
well?
of that's part of the SCDR.
Well, I mean, it's huge, right? I've seen other products in this space. I used to advise them. The ability to create an exchange where I can truly provide my controls in once for multiple companies to use has a huge advantage. I've just not really seen it get a lot of traction, adoption over the past 15 plus years.
You gotta make it easy.
Yeah.
Because in the past, I think companies had to answer very big questionnaires, hundreds of questions to get on the exchange.
The SIG, 1,400
Exactly,
plus
and
questions.
so the bar to get on the exchange was too high.
Yeah.
You need to make it easier.
There you go. So if you make it easy, you get that data in there. Now you can exchange it. Now, new suppliers and new, I call them vendors for lack of a better term, the banks or the buyers on the other side, you can now start to streamline the process to onboard a new vendor, but also then manage that vendor over their life cycle.
You know, the other part I think that we need to do as a security industry, we need to get internal teams of in cybersecurity communicating to each other. So a lot of the time, the TPRM, third-party risk team, is not really working together with the SOC,
Right.
which is strange. We need to bring the SOC and the TPRM together and give them a tools so that it's not just a check-the-box exercise by TPRM team, but also they collaborate with the SOC to actually reduce the risk in your supply chain system, and we're not seeing this happening
I know.
enough.
Well, it's actually a little more complex than that. I've seen configurations where you have a threat team, a vulnerability team, a SOC, the compliance team, the TPRM team might be under the compliance team. You could have 3 or 4 different teams not communicating and sharing the data back and forth. A platform like this could start to do that. I'm curious, then how does this, the other interface obviously is the procurement side of the house. How do you see procurement's usage of a supply chain detection and response tool? Because a lot of the times the vendor process starts on the procurement side and then kind of trickles through what we would call traditional third-party risk management approach. Do you see the procurement side leveraging a product like this to help them manage those contracts?
Yeah, we see it quite often, but also, you know, you could just integrate with SAP Ariba or Coupa, and you pull the triggers when a new contract is added or a new supplier is added. That should just trigger automatic set of actions in terms of a risk assessment that needs to happen.
Right.
We need to see this more of this automation and integration into procurement side of the house as well.
Right, yeah. Well, it sounds like a very
And you know, the
interesting
interesting part is, a lot of the time it's shocking, but you talk to a lot of big companies, they don't even know who their suppliers are.
I know.
You might ask them, well, wait a sec, you're paying them money, that's your supplier.
Right.
How could you not know who your suppliers are? But you got lots of disjointed silos where these companies are identified using different identifiers. There's also a big question about the data normalization and unify and all that stuff, and knowing who to contact.
I know.
And that's why I think SCDR is very important, because a lot of the time, companies don't even know who to talk to if there's a vulnerability in a supplier. And so we need to give them this communication layer.
So back in the day, I used to have to go to the general ledger to figure out the vendors, because I had to look for the payments, and who was making the payments and which accounts were they coming for, otherwise I couldn't figure out that relationship. Yeah, it's very challenging still to this day. Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that, if anybody's interested in learning more, please visit securityweekly.com/SecurityScorecard RSAC. Stay tuned, we got more interviews coming up.